Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. How did Novak Djokovic's lawyers win the world number 1's case? If you're new to this channel, I'm the author of 101 true crime books. I also have a background in sport, individual sports such as swimming, cycling, athletics, and triathlon. In this video, we're going to examine the legal aspect to how did Djokovic win his case in court. And the answer is on a technicality. They basically argued that Novak was denied the right of reply. My rudimentary understanding of the case initially was that Novak was rushed and that his visa was cancelled too hastily. I understand how a rush to judgment scenario could be used against the authorities. We see this quite often as a defense in high-profile true crime cases, including the O.J. Simpson case, the John Benet Ramsey case, the Casey Anthony case, the Madeleine McCann case to some extent, and the Amanda Knox case. Although it's a handy defense in terms of holding the authorities to a high standard of procedural protocols, it tends to be a subjective question on whether these high standards are reasonable. It's a question of reasonableness, right? Interestingly, Novak's lawyers didn't only focus on procedure, they highlighted 7 different grounds. One has the sense that they threw a number of accusations, almost like throwing spaghetti against a wall, and, well, some of it did stick with the presiding judge. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I am going to be quoting fairly extensively from an excellent article dealing with this particular topic, Novak Djokovic, How Tennis Player Won Visa Row, court case. And according to the BBC's assessment, and they go into quite a lot of detail, although they seem very much on Novak's side, they say, quote, Djokovic's lawyer argued a range of legal errors, 7 different grounds, including invalid exercise of power. But ultimately they won essentially on 2 of these grounds, the common law principle of procedural fairness as well as legal unreasonableness. These protections aim to ensure an individual is treated properly when undergoing assessment by a public official. They can be used in any number of everyday situations, such as when you're challenging a tax claim or fighting against rezoning plans, right? According to the article, in this case, it was about the processes an immigration official took in deciding to cancel a visa for Djokovic. They describe him as the tennis star. And the critical question was, did they give Djokovic enough time to process what was happening? And was he allowed the opportunity to give them a complete response, right? And his lawyers argued that he wasn't. He wasn't given the right of reply, essentially. And so if you want to reduce Novak's defense to kind of a soundbite, it's this. He wasn't given enough time. Now, what do you think that means? When you imagine the scenario, without any of the facts, we'll get to the facts in a moment. How do you imagine this idea of you didn't have enough time to respond? How does that play out in your mind? And it's really interesting to actually find this out and figure out the answer to the question. In my mind, I imagine Novak's in a line, perhaps in a crowded airport. I've been in that situation many, many times. I've arrived late at night, early in the morning, whenever. And you are kind of in a hurry to get out of the airport scenario. You want to get settled, right? You want to get showered, you want to get changed, and in some cases you want to get some sleep, get some rest. And so you can kind of imagine there are people in front of him, there are people behind him, and within moments of ascertaining Novak's unvaccinated status, you can sort of imagine the airport official vindictively stamping denied or cancelled across the visa. In other words, in this imagined scenario, everything takes place in seconds or at the most a few minutes. And think about yourself going through passport control. How long has it usually taken you? How long have you ever been sort of in an airport situation trying to get through? Has it been how long has it usually been? And so it kind of makes sense to imagine that, right? But if you consider who we're dealing with here and the actual situation, it's the world's number one tennis player and his wealth and his personality and his feistiness on the tennis court. One can imagine the encounter lasting a lot longer. But the longer it lasts, the harder it becomes to defend the scenario of not being given enough time. On the other hand, Novak could argue his first language isn't English, so he would need a bit more time to understand what's going on. Just as Amanda Knox argued she couldn't understand Italian very well, although she went on to testify on her own behalf in fluent Italian in court. In any event, returning to the article, quote, "It was abundantly clear that Djokovic wanted more time until at least 8:30 in the morning, that's Melbourne time, to speak with his lawyers, to speak with Tennis Australia, to see what was going on and what was in his interest." And that is according to his lawyer, Nick Wood. And I don't know much about his lawyer, Nick Wood, but his lawyer sounds a little bit like an Australian, I'm assuming, Nick Wood. Going on, he was told apparently, quote-unquote, spurious claims from immigration officials that were urging him to do this interview regarding his status earlier than promised, right? And several pages of the transcript, so it was obviously recorded, this meeting, show the officials actually pressuring him. And it would actually be good to have access to that transcript, to the full transcript. And Mr. Wood called this pressuring manifestly unjust, according to the article. And Judge Anthony Kelly agreed. He described Djokovic many times as incommunicado, that he couldn't communicate, he didn't have his phone, he didn't have access to help, right? And this judge, according to the article, was visibly frustrated with Djokovic's treatment during the hearing on Monday. And so it would be interesting if any of that footage was recorded. I'm talking about the footage during this interview, if it was recorded, besides in the transcript, if it was actually recorded on camera. It would be interesting to see what is kind of going on. What was Djokovic's role? How did he respond? What questions did he ask? And so the real question is about time. What time did Novak arrive at the airport? What time did this argument start? How much time did he have? What do you think the answer is? How much time do you think is reasonable under the circumstances? According to the article, quote, "A person sitting in the shoes of Mr. Djokovic is not going to care about the hundreds of provisions in the Migration Act. He just says, tell me what's going on. I don't understand this. Give me my phone back and let's try and get a real response." But Djokovic wasn't allowed that opportunity to get help. And that's the end of the quote. It does feel often in this article that it is, you almost get the sense that his lawyer spoke to the BBC, his lawyer was interviewed. You don't really get the sense that the other lawyers, the prosecution lawyers, were interviewed. So it feels like you're getting the defense case. You're getting the defense side of things. The bulk of it is coming from the defense side. Going back to the article, quote, "All of the facts and circumstances compel a conclusion that given fair opportunity to deal with what he wanted to by 8:30, he would have. There was a responsibility on the official that he should have been afforded this," according to Judge Kelly. And that's the end of the quote, "We know the exact time Novak's visa was cancelled. It was 7:40 in the morning, or 20 to 8. That was 50 minutes earlier than the time he wanted to get clarity." So essentially, I think he was given, he was basically in a state of limbo for 8.5 hours. Or he wanted to be in a state of limbo for at least 8.5 hours, and he was ultimately in a state of limbo for around 7 hours, 40 minutes, if you take it from midnight. So let's look at his ordeal prior to his visa being cancelled. Let's look at how the time unfolded, right? So according to the article, quote, "The tennis star spent more than 8 hours in immigration holding after 25 hours flying. After landing just before midnight, he was informed of a visa issue but was not told what it was. Around 4 o'clock local time, he was told by an Australian border official that they intended to revoke his visa, end quote. It's unfortunate just all round that Novak wasn't told why there was an issue. But I think it's also odd that Novak would have no idea what it might be about, given that he'd applied for a medical exemption and given his unvaccinated status. I think this idea that he would have no idea is a little bit odd. I think it's also perhaps strange that he would not have raised this himself. But apparently he didn't know, and upon finding out, he was shocked. He was shocked that this was the case. This is to some extent understandable, that essentially the same authority that had granted him his visa theoretically was now denying him. I mean, the Australian embassy had to have granted him the visa for him to travel, right? And now on the other side, no, now you can't come into the country. So going back to the article, Djokovic was shocked because he believed he'd been fully cleared by the authorities to enter the country on a medical exemption. He was on his own and asked to postpone the interview until 8:30 so he could contact his lawyers and the tennis authorities when they woke up. He repeatedly requested this so he could get more clarity on the case, end quote. So you've got to understand that he wants to delay things so that people in Australia can wake up, right, including Tennis Australia, so that he can rouse them, so that he can contact them. And this does kind of make sense. Because of the time zone difference, Novak was dealing with people who were theoretically asleep. I'm talking about back in Serbia, so his own people. And some people turn off their phones after hours, and this would be in Australia that morning. So one presumes Novak wanted to contact his people in Serbia, which is 10 hours behind Melbourne, Australia. If that's true, then at 4 o'clock in the morning in Melbourne, that is 6 o'clock in the evening in Belgrade. In other words, just after business hours. 4 o'clock in the morning in Australia is also before business hours in Australia. So you can imagine tennis officials being asleep that early in the morning. You can imagine lawyers being asleep at that time of the morning. You can imagine his agent possibly, not sure where he was, but possibly also being asleep if he was in Australia. And so going back to the article, I don't really know what to do at 4 a.m. That is what he told the officer. He said, it's 4 a.m., I don't know what to do. If you allow me to switch on my phone and make a call to my agent and try to get hold of people from Tennis Australia, and I think he was basically playing for time. They're saying, can you give me four and a half more hours to make a call, right? And so at 5 o'clock, an official agreed to Djokovic's request upon consulting supervisors. So there you kind of had a situation where the immigration official heard his right of reply, if you think about it. You know, I'm not sure what to do. Or you could say, you could hear part of the right of reply, that I need to speak to my people, and the guy went and spoke to his supervisors who decided they would give him more time. But then he was only left he was only left alone for less than an hour, and then he was woken up by 3 officers. So obviously they returned at around about 6 o'clock, right? I do think if you go back to this whole idea of that he was rushed and that they didn't give him enough time, you actually see that Novak was left completely alone and even allowed to sleep in the situation. Does it seem like he was being rushed if he was sort of allowed to sleep? Anyway, they returned at 6 o'clock in the morning. This is now 6 hours into the whole debacle. And they say, you know, it'll be easier for you to get the interview over and done with. And there's not really a point in waiting for your lawyer's response. Right? And at this point, Novak has been at the airport, as I say, for over 6 hours. And he's known about his predicament now for at least 2 hours. Do you think he's being rushed? Anyway, going further, quote, Djokovic said again he wanted to wait until 8:30, but the officials pressured him into the interview. In his affidavit, Djokovic told the court he felt he had no choice, and so he relented. He said something like, I know you're going to cancel my visa. It's obvious, he told the officials, according to the transcript. There's that feistiness again. Shortly after the assessment at about 7:40 in the morning, his visa was cancelled and he was taken into detention. That's the end of the quoted section. And one does wonder if Djokovic had simply refused, if these officials had pressured him into the interview and he'd said, I refuse to do it until 8:30, what would the situation have been? And also if he had called and found out and spoken to his lawyer and spoken to Tennis Australia and taken as much time as he needed, what would the situation have been then? Between the time Novak was informed why there was an issue with his visa and it actually being cancelled, 3 hours, 14 minutes passed. That's almost 4 hours. It also sounds like his interview or assessment may have taken almost 2 hours. I'm not sure if there would have been a queue with other people, but none of this seems to suggest a rush. In fact, the opposite. According to Novak's lawyers, he was asking for more time. If it had been me at the airport, I would have been asking for things to speed up. As it was, Novak arrived before midnight and the issue was dealt with in whichever way almost 8 hours later. That doesn't seem to me to be a rush. I suppose you could factor in sleep, but 7:40 in the morning was earlier than 10 o'clock at night in Belgrade. It would have been 20 to 10 in Belgrade or 9:40 in the evening. Then there's a short section at the end of the article that Australia's lawyers argued, quote, that Djokovic already had a long opportunity to explain his case to the border official. They also said that there is no evidence that his lawyers would or could have done anything in that intervening period. Going on with the article, but in court on Monday, Novak's lawyer said this was too weak a rebuttal against the standards confirmed by the judge and the evidence of Djokovic's team. They could see that the immigration official had done the wrong thing. And then Judge Kelly read out the order, which he said that the Australian government concedes that their representatives' decision to proceed with the interview and decide to cancel the visa was unreasonable in the circumstances. What do you think? Do you think it was unreasonable? One wonders what Novak's attitude was during the hours he was made to stay at the airport. We know he was shocked. Did this have a role in both hurrying and unsettling the authorities? Did he almost kind of pressure them, guys, just let's get this sorted out kind of thing? Didn't Novak put pressure on them to resolve the case? The don't you know who I am approach. Of course, I think in this legal context, whatever Novak's demeanor or attitude, the legal test is what was the attitude of the authorities? Did they overstep the mark? In sum, the outcome of this case was a clever dodge from the original issue. So it gets through on a technicality. I mean, the original question is, was Novak vaccinated or not? And in the end, he was allowed into Australia, not because he met the vaccine protocols, but because the authorities rushed into cancelling his visa, a rush that took all of almost 8 hours. So I'm not going to take it further than that, but I will put links to the footage of the case that was heard in Australia. It was heard kind of like a live stream. I'll put 2 links to that in the description, as well as a link to this excellent article, which is my source material from the BBC. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.